and I'm the chair of the Stop the War Coalition. And we've organised this meeting called Stop Bombing Iran and say no to warfare, or welfare, not warfare. What we think, we've organised this jointly with CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And we've organised it at what we think is an important time in global politics, with the on-off war, or more on than off war, between the United States on Iran, with the dangers of that escalating and more threats from Donald Trump that he intends to escalate that. In conjunction with the continued attack from Israel on Gaza and Palestine. So we think this is a very dangerous time, and one in which we need to build anti-war voices and anti-war activity in this country. At the same time, this is happening as we have a new prime minister, but no discernible change in direction from that prime minister in terms of global politics and international politics. A commitment from Andy Burnham to increase military spending, and a commitment to continuing with the nuclear arms program, and allowing the use of British bases, allowing the US the use of British bases for their attacks on Iran. So we've got some very good speakers to come from you. The first thing I'm going to do is read a statement. Diane Abbott wasn't able to join us tonight, but she has sent a statement that I think sets out the context of the meeting very well. So I'm going to read that out, and then I'm going to tell you how we're going to deal with a Q&A function in the meeting once we've got the speakers go, that you can use once we've got the speakers going. So this is from Diane Abbott. Thank you all for coming this evening, and I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person. The Iran war is wholly unjustified. It has included targeted assassinations, the brazen destruction of civilian infrastructure, and murder of innocent civilians, including 165 schoolgirls at the Minab school. All of these are war crimes, and yet none have been condemned by Western governments, who talk so cheaply about human rights. The British government goes even further in its spinelessness towards Trump, allowing US heavy bombers to take off from British bases to pound Iran and to commit some of these very war crimes. But it is not all going the way of these war criminals and their allies. The US cannot unilaterally reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which is causing huge disruption to global trade and the price of essential goods. The conflict is also spreading to include almost every country in the region, and is provoking parallel conflict, such as clashes between Saudi Arabia and Ansar Allah. Britain and Europe are pretending this has nothing to do with us, but they offer support to Trump, the most erratic president ever. And prices are rising. There are growing shortages, and the world is increasingly divided into two armed camps. Netanyahu claims that Iran is days away from a nuclear weapon. He's been saying that for over 40 years. Even US intelligence agencies do not believe it. Countries like Britain should not be supporting a war illegally launched and carried out with multiple war crimes. It's making us poorer and less safe, and doing enormous damage to Iran and the wider region. Hands off Iran, no support for bombing, stop arming Israel, no increase in Britain's military budget. So that's from Diane Abbott, and I think that sets out the context for this meeting very well. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to alert you to the fact that the chat function is not open for this meeting, but we will be taking questions and answers. If you want to, we'll ask you to submit questions, and we'll pick some out and put those to our speakers as we go through the meeting. So if you want to post a question, if you look at the panel at the bottom of the screen where you've got all the facilities at the bottom of the screen. There's a circle with 3 dots inside it. If you click on that, you can see a sort of text box with a question mark and Q&A written under that. If you click on that, you can then type a question, and we'd ask you to type questions rather than statements, which we will then ask either 1 or 2 or all of our speakers to come back on as we go through the meeting. So down at the bottom, circle with 3 dots in, look for the Q&A function inside there. Okay, so our first speaker tonight is from Stop the War Coalition, an officer of Stop the War and someone who's been doing a lot of work on working with the youth movement, particularly around issues of conscription and militarization in schools. I'd like to welcome Shabbir Lakha to the meeting.
Thanks a lot, Alex, and thank you all for joining this meeting today. I think it's extremely important, as Alex and Diane sort of set out already, because I think this is a huge escalation of war that we are witnessing, and a threat of a much wider conflagration. I think Trump's recent sort of breaking of the ceasefire and airstrikes on Iran threatened a return to a full-blown warfare, which has already cost the lives of thousands of Iranian civilians, thousands of Lebanese civilians, and tens of thousands of people who have been wounded. And this time round, what we saw was the expansion of the war immediately. We saw, the actions by the Houthis in Yemen to try and blockade the Red Sea in an effort to stop the aggression against Iran, which was immediately met by Saudi Arabia with the pulling together of a coalition of countries to carry out airstrikes on Yemen, and the threat of a ground invasion, which is still hanging. And at the same time, I think we have seen an escalation in the war between Ukraine and Russia, and a turn, particularly within US policy, which, since the election of Trump has been somewhat hesitant to carry on the level of US support for the war effort in Ukraine, but which seems to be turning. And we see now that, Western troops are overtly participating in the carrying out of long-range missile strikes on Russia. We saw recently Zelensky, along with Netanyahu, were in Washington to meet with Trump. We saw Ukraine carrying out an airstrike on an Iranian ship in the Caspian Sea. All of this, which I think is threatening the sort of coalescing of the two theaters of war, which are intensifying in and of themselves as well. And of course, alongside all of this, we have the continuing genocide in Gaza. Netanyahu using the moment to solidify Israel's further occupation of Gaza and setting up new military installations there, of the rapidly escalating pogroms against Palestinians in the West Bank, and Israel determined to hold on to its occupation of huge swathes of Lebanese territory, and refusing to withdraw. But I think, as Alex said, in terms of the war on Iran itself, I think the sort of stop-start nature of it has produced uncertainty of where it's going. But I think one thing that has been clear, and which is now widely sort of reported on and considered in the mainstream, is that by all accounts, this has been a failure for the United States. I think it's been clear in recent weeks with the sort of tit-for-tat strikes and so on, that Iran has been setting the pace of the war and how it's going. It is the one that is determining when and if negotiations are taking place. We have a repeated pattern of Trump threatening massive escalation of violence against Iran, only to call it off at the last minute and to claim that Iran is begging for negotiations and all that. And I think the sort of any credibility that Trump and the United States had left has been massively diminished. And we've seen at the same time, not only from the initial part of the war, but more recently as well, that Iran's ability to strike US assets in the region has proved a deterrence on the US escalating the war further. We know from recent reports that the US's air defense systems have been massively depleted. Something like 80% of THAAD missiles have been used. Some half of the US's Patriot missile stock has been depleted. And we know that Pete Hegseth was requesting an extra $67 billion from Congress to try and speed up replenishing this stock of missiles, but which he, as he said, would take a long time to do anyway. We've also seen that the effect of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has massively increased the price of oil as well as other commodities, and that the sort of war goals that the United States had initially of entirely removing the regime in Iran, of destroying its ability to enrich uranium and so on, have now all been dropped for the single policy of opening the Strait of Hormuz, which was open prior to the war beginning, and that Iran is determined to not include the US in its negotiations with Oman, and that it's almost certain that the outcome of this will be at least some level of Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz and its ability to charge tolls on ships going through and so on. And I think if you remember back to during COVID when there was a ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal for several days, and the huge immediate impact it had on the supply of goods across the entire globe. You compound that with what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz, as well as the sort of largely successful blockade of the northern Red Sea by the Houthis in Yemen. You can see that the impact that this will have on our still very brittle sort of global supply chains. And I think all of this is part of why the war in Iran has become deeply unpopular in the United States. It started from a position of being very unpopular, and it's only become more unpopular. I think the price of oil in the US is now $4 a gallon. I think, polls after polls are showing that Trump is becoming increasingly unpopular. And I think this is resulting in a massive crisis for Trump, who's, set to face midterms in the next few months. We've seen a split within the Republican Party, a new party set up by Tucker Carlson, and so specifically on the lines of opposing the war in Iran and from a sort of right-wing perspective, but also that this is sort of feeding into a polarization, which has seen the election of left-wing candidates from the Democratic Socialists of America in a number of primaries, and so on. I think it was clear that Trump launched this war fresh off his swift decapitation of the Venezuelan government and kidnapping of Maduro. He was encouraged by Netanyahu, who has long sought a war with Iran and who, through 2.5 years of genocide in Gaza and attacks on Lebanon and attacks on Yemen, was able to claim that he had severely diminished the US's enemies in the region and created an opportune moment for the US to re-establish its declining hegemony in the region. But in fact, it has done the precise opposite and has accelerated or at least clarified the US losing its grip. And I think the response to this in Europe has been a rush to drastically ramp up its remilitarization. And I think this is partly an attempt to sort of scramble to return to its place by the US's side, but it's partly also to shore up its ability to project power independently as well. And we see this, recently Germany has committed to borrowing 800 billion euros in order to spend on defense. We've seen the setting up of Rearm Europe, the reintroduction of conscription to some level in at least 10 countries. And in the UK, as was said, one of the first things that Andy Burnham did upon becoming Prime Minister was to reauthorize the use of British bases for launching attacks on Iran. He has appointed John Healey, the arch war hawk who resigned from Starmer's government for not spending enough on defense, to the position of Chancellor, who has since appointed several of the top brass in the military to the sort of treasury team with no opposition. And we see this as part of a wider, I think, sort of invasion of militarism in all aspects of society, and particularly, as Alex mentioned, I've been doing work with sort of students and young people, and we see the crisis in higher education to ship in the military industrial complex into education. A couple of weeks ago, the government launched its Defense Universities Alliance, which has at least 35 universities and colleges signing up to a deal with the Ministry of Defense to receive billions of pounds in funding to um, sorry, to basically sort of funnel students into the military industrial complex. We've seen the military being given an extra £70 million to expand its cadet program in schools and to try and recruit schools into the military and so on. And I think all of this is the context for why we had the International Anti-War Conference in June and why it was so important, because this is a massive ramping up of war and militarism across Europe and across the globe. And it is directly coming at the cost, of human lives in the Middle East, in Ukraine and in Russia and Sudan and elsewhere, but also of working class people here at home who are seeing our welfare, our public services, and everything being sacrificed at the altar of funding the military to ever greater extent. So I think as well as the sort of inherent dangers in the situation that we face, and they are huge, and the challenges ahead of us are massive. I think we have an opportunity in the sense of the widespread opposition there is to this, and the sort of coalescing of these things that are coming to bear, and the I think the opening that we had with the International Anti-War Conference in international coordination and pulling the labor movement in Britain into the anti-war movement. And I think we need to use that to really strengthen anti-war organizing all over the country and at all levels. And I think the days of action that we have coming up on the 10th of October for Palestine, on the 30th of October in support of the Dockers, we're going to be stopping arms getting shipped to Israel. And on the 20th of November in opposing militarism and conscription, the 20th of November being a student day of action and the 21st of November being a national day of protest, are hugely important focal points for us to really build a movement and to sort of strengthen it in areas we haven't been able to so far. So what I would urge, just as a final note, is there's a model motion that we've produced which sets out the sort of what we came out of the international conference with and support for these international days of action. If you're in a trade union, please make sure it gets passed there in your local branch. If you in another campaigning organization, get them to sign up to supporting those days of action. And we need to make those absolutely massive. And I think out of all of it, we need to build Stop the War as the organization that is pulling through all these strands of opposition to the genocide in Palestine, to the war in Iran, to the war in Ukraine, to the cuts to welfare, to the drastically deteriorating climate that we're seeing right now. We need to build Stop the War. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Shabbir. And Stop the War has an August membership offer, £25 for a year's membership, and it includes 10% off goods from the Stop the War shop. So take advantage of that. We'll remind you of those dates that Shabbir mentioned as the meeting goes on. There is another date for your diary that I'm sure Sophie will talk about when she gets the opportunity to speak. A protest at the RAF Fairford base on Saturday, the 15th of August. So that's next weekend, along the perimeter fence in sight of US bombers and the huge runway that they're using for their bombing mission. So more about that as the meeting goes on. I'm going to go straight to our next speaker, and it's wonderful to have this group here, Iranians Against War. Please welcome Atefeh Zandi.
There you go. Sorry, I was trying to come off mute. Thank you so much. And thank you, Shabbir, for starting off on such a good note. So I'm Atefeh. I am from the Iranians Against War community. The name is self-explanatory. We are against war, anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist community of Iranians who stand for Iran's sovereignty, self-determination, and the right to a future from endless wars and foreign intervention. What I wanted to touch on a little bit, what we wanted to really talk about was to dive a little bit deeper into some of the root causes consequences of why we're here today, and then also talk about some of the actions that we can take. And thinking about the current situation facing Iran, the devastating attacks and escalating conflict ultimately brings us back to one fundamental question, which is who has the right to determine Iran's future and what does self-determination actually look like? And we can't have this conversation without first understanding Iran's long-standing fight for sovereignty and the right to shape its own future. It is the thread running through every major conflict in Iran's modern history. And in this case, sovereignty is far more than just protecting our physical borders. It is the right for us to govern without external intervention in our political affairs, is to own and control natural resources and to trade them freely on our own terms, to invest in homegrown industries from technology and pharmaceuticals to defense without facing threats of crushing sanctions, isolation, or even annihilation, as Trump called it out, for refusing to become dependent on foreign powers or giant corporations. It also means the freedom for us to invest in research and development through Iran's world-renowned universities and scientific institutions, that's including our nuclear science, energy, and medicine, without our nuclear scientists, doctors, academics being assassinated in the name of peace and liberation. Whether people agree with every policy that the Iranian state, policy of the Iranian state or not, is really besides the point. But understanding this concept of sovereignty is essential in understanding Iran's current positioning. And at every step, Iranians have faced violent, disproportionate aggression designed to destroy their ability for to be a self-sustaining power in their own right. And it's always aggression fabricated in claims about safety and security, as we hear every time. And this is how Western imperialism justifies its crimes. And an independent, capable Iran is quite literally the greatest threat to their colonial agenda. Iran has the resources, the knowledge, and the capability to stand on its own, and that's quite scary. And it's a strong contender in a multipolar world. And this is why it has been targeted over and over again. But if we just take a step back, because this struggle didn't start 50 years ago, even though some would lead you to believe that our situation is self-inflicted or avoidable, those people fail to realize that some of the most inhumane and brutal sanctions in Iran's history came before the revolution. So when Mossadegh, Iran's first democratic leader, nationalized the oil industry and reclaimed control of our country's resources in 1951, Iran actually faced some of its earliest economic sanctions back then. So this didn't start in 1978, as they would have you believe. And also, Britain actually has played quite a prominent role in Iran's political landscape and interferences that are leading to today's suffering. For 75 years, for those that don't know, Britain had controlled the extraction, refining, and trading of Iranian oil as though it was its own, revealing nothing about the process or the profits and returning less than 16%, that's 1/6, of the proceeds to the Iranian government. Iran's own resources were extracted and sold, while Iranians lived in poverty, died in inhumane conditions, and were treated as third-class citizens in their own country. So Iran's fight for independence began the moment it chose to nationalize its oil, and the West answered with crushing sanctions and economic terrorism, with a heavy human cost to pay in medicine shortages, power cuts, hyperinflation, and so much suffering across our population to this very day. But the story doesn't quite end with oil. Every conflict we've seen in the world has begun with imperialists and colonizers looting resources and seizing land that isn't theirs. And that's always followed by the villainization and killing of the very oppressed people that dare to resist or fight back. And the same principle and pattern applies to Iran's missile program. So quite literally the only thing that's guaranteeing our people's safety in this current war. For a bit of context, during the Iran-Iraq war, between 300,000 to 500,000 Iranians were killed, many by chemical weapons backed by the United States, weapons that are illegal under international law. And Iran was not able to retaliate, it was not able to protect itself, and it paid with the blood of its children and its young people trying to defend our land. And it's also worth mentioning that at that time, Western countries actually refused to sell chemical masks to Iran, so while our people were being suffocated and bombarded by chemical bombs. And you can see the same pattern now with Iran's domestic nuclear program built for energy use and Iran's right over the Strait of Hormuz. So that's a strategic checkpoint that sits in Iranian territory and is vital to Iran's security. And now we are being told and gaslit that Iran has no rights over its own waterways. I guess the deeper issue ultimately for us is sovereignty itself. That's Iran's right to self-determination, to sustain itself, to sit outside a global banking system so it can't be controlled, to defend its land and its asset without being bombed into oblivion. Another tweet from Trump, even though Iran has never launched an unprovoked attack on another country. And the narrative in the media shifts from one pretext to another. But the core issue never changes, and that's Iran's right to hold over power over its own affairs. Ultimately, what the US and Israel want is a weak Iran and a failed state, divided and defenseless and unable to fight back, unable to resist, so more resources and land can be taken. The destabilization of Iran has actually been a long-term strategy. This is not a fluke. It's been cultivated over decades, aimed at pillars that uphold Iranian society. In 2009, a US think tank came up with this book called Which Path to Persia, which I'll definitely recommend for people to check out. And this laid that out explicitly. Strategic options to fracture Iran's national cohesion in service of regional objectives, to continue the theft of resources, control regional governments, and advance the Zionist colonial project in Palestine and beyond. And the intent was always destruction. The book literally spells it out: sanctions, military intervention, engineered regime change, support for opposition groups, coordinated unrest, and armed riots, all designed to weaken Iran from within. And we've seen many examples of those quite recently to liberate Iranians. But who are the Western governments to define liberation for Iranians? Iran's internal affairs belong to Iranians alone, and political change has to happen from within the country, not in foreign intervention. I guess another important lever used to weaken Iranian unity has been through endless propaganda. We're all very familiar with it. And unfortunately, we are up against one of the most well-funded strategic propaganda operations in the world. And it's one built to twist the truth and undermine Iran's national unity. Outlets like BBC Persian, which is funded by the British taxpayer, so mine and yours, and the Israeli-backed Iran International have fed lies and propaganda to our nation for decades. Most Iranians would be very familiar with both channels. And as a result, Iranians like us who oppose war, have been made to feel afraid to speak up, and the platform has been handed over to Zionist-aligned voices, calling for the return of a monarch that was exiled 50 years ago, and they manufactured consent for more death and destruction. So anti-war, pro-democracy Iranians have been silenced through intimidation, doxing, harassment, and in some cases, even death threats. We've seen many instances of these, even within our own communities. I guess looking forward, our task is to educate people about the history as we've done today and levers that got us here. We have to teach people to recognize biased language in the news and call it out as a language that has done so much damage over time and has manufactured consent for so many deadly wars. And change begins with refusing to let lies be told about our people and refuse to let those responsible for war crimes hide behind convenient narratives. As an example, British land for defense purposes only has been used as a launchpad for deadly jets that are dropping bombs on innocent Iranians right now. And it's a false and convenient narrative that the British leadership have created to refuse any accountability. The UK and the Labour Party need to stop behind in this false narrative of defence only, as they are fully complicit. There is nothing defensive about this illegal, deadly war. Planes are literally taking off from our countryside in Fairford, and they are heavily operated by the US military, and they're dropping 2,000-pound bombs on innocent Iranians. And just 2 days ago, 3 family members were killed in Iran with bombs that were made in America and with bombers that took off British lands. Britain must pursue an independent foreign policy guided by peace, diplomacy, and respect for national sovereignty, not by automatic alignment with US military interventions. We call for an end to policies that fuel conflict, including sanctions and militarization, and for a foreign policy based on dialogue, mutual respect, and international cooperation. Us Iranians, we hold a wide spectrum of political views, and that's shaped by different experiences. But right now, we have one thing in common, and that is our unity against common threats. The question isn't whether we have the numbers. Historically, we've been silenced and we've been outnumbered, but it's whether we have the courage to do the right thing, stand up for our country, despite the death threats and the doxing, and speak up for our homeland. We also wanted to ask today from our brothers and sisters in the anti-war community to support us in this fight, to see the Iranian struggle under inhumane sanctions that have caused endless human suffering and deadly bombs launched from British bases to kill children in Iran. Thank you so much for providing a platform that's elevating Iranian voices. We're really grateful. We just want our country not to be bombed and for our people to be left in peace.
Thank you, Atefeh, for being here tonight. Thank you to you and your colleagues and comrades, brothers and sisters, for having the courage to speak up and to do what you do. We think it's really important that we hear your voices at meetings like this and do pass on our solidarity and our commitment from Stop the War and CND. I think I can say that to working with you and to opposing the US and the UK endorsed bombing of Iran. We will continue to do that. So thank you for being here. Just before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to say we are aware that some of you are still here with audio only, that you can't turn your videos on and that you may not be able to see the videos of our speakers. We think that's to do with the Zoom anti-screen capture facility, but we're not quite sure whether we can turn that off or whether you have to turn that off. It's something new and something that we had to sort of grapple with a bit as we were coming into the meeting. We think it's a minority of you, but we hope that the speakers are coming through loud and clear, even if you can't see them, and we may not be able to see you. So apologies for that. We're still trying to work on it. We've got one question in the Q&A at the minute. I'm just going to put it out there. And then if people want to think about it, the speakers want to think about it and come back later or pick it up when they speak. It's from Zara. It says, with the oil price fluctuating a lot and Trump's admin engineering it by different means, can we still say that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is still an effective tool for Iran for showing deterrence towards the aggressors? So it's a question about the tactics of closing the Strait of Hormuz when the US can engineer oil prices by different means. So I don't know if anyone feels that when we come back to those questions, anyone feels that they might be able to offer some thoughts on that. So I'm going to go to our next speaker. I said this meeting was jointly called by Stop the War and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Our two organizations have been working together for 25 years since the creation of Stop the War, together with CND, opposing the war on terror, Bush and Blair's war on terror, organizing the big marches in 2001, 2002 and 2003, and consistently opposing imperialist wars, consistently aiming to hold our governments and our prime ministers and our politicians to account for their actions or complicity in wars abroad. And we will continue to work together. Both organizations have played a major part in the Palestine Coalition and are working together on campaigns around the wars in Iran and Ukraine and elsewhere. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Sophie Bolt.
Thanks very much, Alex. It's great to be here. And also it's great to follow Atefeh. Really, really brilliant speech, really profound and great to meet you. Looking forward to campaigning with you more. So, obviously, this, I think it's absolutely horrifying that we are now 6 months into this illegal, unprovoked war by the US and Israel against Iran. And of course, before that, last year, we had the US-Israeli illegal bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities back then, and it's just been a series of war crime after war crime after war crime. The assassination of Iran's supreme leader, the massacre of the school children at Minab, the destroying critical civilian infrastructure like bridges, targeting oil depots, creating these horrific environmental disasters, poisoning, civilians with toxic chemicals released, from these bombings, hitting desalination plants, cutting off tens of thousands of people from life-saving water. All of these are war crimes, out and out. And of course, we've seen the repeated bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz and Bushehr, risking the release of radioactive particles into the atmosphere, a breach of both the UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency's charters. Now, throughout this, the British government said, oh, but we're not involved in this war. Yet, from the get-go, even before the US started bombing Iran, RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk and RAF Mildenhall were already being used to fly US jets out to US bases in the Gulf. And of course, as Atefeh said, RAF Fairford in Gloucester, throughout March, dozens and dozens of US long-range bombers from Fairford were carrying out twice daily bombing missions, bombing raids, while those war crimes were taking place. Starmer said he would not drag Britain into Trump's war, yet that is exactly what he has done. And in fact, one of his final acts as Prime Minister was to reconfirm British permission for the US to continue to use these British bases. So he kind of forced Burnham's hand actually by doing that. But, Burnham has kind of endorsed it and has now, through that endorsement has created this very sort of serious crisis for Britain. Just 2 weeks ago, we know that a US bomber flying from Fairford again attacked Iran. And as a result of that, Iran's foreign ministry stated that Britain is an accomplice to the US's illegal war and now views British bases like RAF Fairford as legitimate targets. Now, this wasn't the first time that Iran had warned Britain that it might be targeted. Just before Starmer agreed to the use of these bases, so back in late February, Iran had raised this, saying that this would be the case. Starmer took no notice, but Britain's attempt to hide behind these sort of spurious arguments that Fairford is being used for defensive operations just cannot be justified. Actively assisting a country breaching international law is illegal. Yeah, it's totally indefensible. And now, Burnham is potentially dragging Britain right into the middle of this war, because following Iran's statement that British bases are legitimate targets, the government released a statement saying the UK stands ready 24/7 to defend itself against Iran, and said that it's working closely with NATO allies in this regard. So this risks a greater escalation with the involvement of nuclear-armed alliance of NATO. Yeah, and we know that this is something that Trump had been pushing for right from the beginning of this deadly war. And why was he pushing for this? Why was he pushing for the involvement of sort of NATO allies? He's trying to end his increased political and military isolation, which has been created through the US's historic illegal actions, historic war crimes against the vast majority of the planet, but also Trump's very brutal sort of US first economic and military actions. And of course, sort of fundamentally, its central political and military support and facilitation of Israel's genocide. Now, and whilst for now, it appears that the US may be listening to the Gulf states, which are urging de-escalation. Like Britain, they host US bases that are attacking Iran, and so their populations, their economies are totally on the front line too. But there is a very real risk that this war will escalate. In terms of, Saudi Arabia and the Yemen being potentially drawn into this conflict, or that that conflict escalating in itself. So it's absolutely critical that all efforts are used to try and re-secure diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation. And this means supporting the implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed in June between the US and Iran. Despite efforts by the US, Britain, and France to scupper it, there has now been good progress made between Iran and Oman to agree a joint proposal on managing and opening up the Strait of Hormuz. And this is absolutely critical for many reasons. Firstly, the Memorandum of Understanding contains the essential elements of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This was the 2015 UN brokered nuclear deal, which Trump trashed 2018. So the MOU provides the same agreement of Iran demonstrating verifiably that it is not developing nuclear weapons, and in return the US will lift all its sanctions that are crippling and devastating the Iranian population. So this is absolutely central to ending this conflict and of course alleviating the absolutely terrible hardship of the Iranian people. And let us be clear, it is the utmost nuclear hypocrisy of the US, of Europe, that are sanctioning Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons, while supporting nuclear-armed Israel in its genocide against the Palestinian people and its deadly plans for Greater Israel. And of course, the nuclear hypocrisy of these nuclear weapon states like the US and Britain, which are expanding their own nuclear weapons and justifying their need for security, to have these nuclear weapons. Total and utter nuclear hypocrisy. The second thing is opening the straits will alleviate this terrible global economic impact in terms of the massive increase in food and energy prices caused by the closure of the straits since February, and has been made, the points have been made, which is the US has basically effectively closed the straits. But thirdly, it will enable a political solution to this crisis, and this is the only way that we're going to end this war. So Britain has an absolutely critical role to play, and withdrawing the use of British bases is central to this because it will put real pressure on Trump. Given how vital these bases are, like Fairford, in terms of the US's ability to commit war crimes against Iran, it's absolutely vital that this lever is properly used. Public opinion in Britain at 58% is strongly against this war and against the use of bases, and this has been growing, this has been increasing. And it's clear that to everyone that the use of British bases has absolutely nothing to do with defending Britain's security interests. On the contrary, it makes us a target and it's making us poorer. So we need to send a really, really strong message to this government. They need to stand up to the Trump administration. Burnham needs to stand up to the Trump administration, and we need to send these US bombers home. So with that in mind, I really, really urge you to come to RAF Fairford on Saturday, the 15th of August. Not this weekend, the next weekend coming. We've got coaches booked from London and elsewhere. If you just go to the CND website, you can get all the details there. I'll see if I can put it into the chat. But it's a very, very empowering experience. And also, I want to tell people that local residents oppose what's going on here. Local residents are very, very, frightened about, the risk of them being targeted. And they already have to put up with, these horrific bombers flying over their homes, day in, day out. Not only the noise pollution, the air pollution, but the fear that this kind of weaponry causes. So it's really, really important that we show, Iran, we show the US that we do not want these bases being used in our name, and they need to be closed down now. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Sophie. We have put in the chat a link to the CND website where you can find details of the protest at RAF Fairford next Saturday, the 15th of August. Do try and arrange with people from your area to get along to that. So we've had three great speakers so far who I think have all contributed to a very rounded perspective that we've got on what's happening so far, from US imperialism to the welfare not warfare debate, to the use of our bases and the threat of nuclear war, to the importance of sovereignty and self-determination for the Iranian people. And our final speaker tonight, I'm really pleased to say, has been able to join us, another Iranian voice, one who's very active in the anti-war movement and bringing the anti-war voice to the trade union movement as General Secretary of the Transport and Salaried Staff Association, the TSSA. Please welcome Maryam Eslamdoust. You are here, Maryam. Please tell me you're here.
She is.
Me?
Yay!
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I am on a motorway, so apologies if the connection isn't great, but I am here. Thanks so much for that introduction, Alex. Hello, everyone. I'm Maryam Eslamdoust. I'm the TSSA's General Secretary. I'm also an Iranian woman. I'm an anti-war activist and a long-term supporter of Stop the War. But also as a trade unionist, I am concerned about geopolitical issues. They matter, they squeeze workers' finances, and this cost of fuel is adversely affecting workers and the global economy. I want to start off with the right to self-defense. This is a phrase and principle being thrown around to defend coercion by Western countries, but any right of self-defense cannot belong to Western countries and their allies. We constantly hear that the United States has the right to defend itself, Britain has the right to defend itself, Israel has the right to defend itself. But when Iran protects its territories and its borders and its people, suddenly that same principle disappears. We are told that Iran's resistance is aggression, whilst American coercion or illegal attacks are legitimate resistance, or this bizarre notion of preemptive attacks. This nonsense rhetoric has no basis in international law. It is imperialism. One set of rules for Washington and another for whoever Washington chooses to threaten. And that applies to Israel as well. Iran has endured decades of sanctions, covert operations, assassinations of scientists, military threats, and smaller scale attacks. Ordinary Iranian people have repeatedly paid the price through inflation, through shortages and economic hardship. And sanctions are often discussed as these polite political diplomatic tools. They are not. They damage livelihoods, they restrict medicine and make everyday life harder for millions of people who have no say in the decisions being made or contested. So supporting Iran's right to sovereignty is not the same as offering uncritical support to everything that the Iranian government does. No, but it is. But right now, it's about sovereignty and the fight for international law to apply equally to states. I want to speak about the Strait of Hormuz. It's now increasingly likely that Iran and Oman could agree arrangements for managing a commercial passage through the strait. And that matters because Iran and Oman are the two coastal states whose territorial waters meet there, and that must be central to any workable arrangements. It's just nonsense that small passage of water is international waters, which is what the US has claimed, at the same time as mooting that the US should have a stake in any tariffs applied there. So if Washington wants to act rationally, and that is a big if, it should allow these arrangements with Iran and Oman to succeed. The United States has no realistic means of removing Iran from the geography of the strait. So a practical arrangement could also lay the groundwork for the next stage of negotiations to end this war. It might, and I say might, give Donald Trump the political cover he appears to need and allow him to blame Oman for concessions while claiming victory at home. that might not be dignified diplomacy, but if it stops people being killed, we should take that opening. It seems clear that both Iran and the United States would prefer this war to end, but also Iran also understands that it can't accept another unsecured pause in the fighting, another agreement that can be abandoned as soon as Donald Trump changes his mind. So Iran will continue resisting for as long as its leaders believe that it's necessary to secure an end, not only to the present war, but to the reoccurring attacks, threats, economic punishments imposed by the US and its allies for decades. So this question of when will Iran stop? It's not when will Iran stop. It is when will the United States accept the concessions, guarantees, and concrete upfront actions that Iran needs before trusting another agreement. So, apologies. So I'm just stopped at a service station. I hope you can still hear me. I think I'm in Germany. I was in Holland just a second ago. So a renewed nuclear agreement looks increasingly unlikely under present conditions. From Tehran's perspectives, the obvious question is, what would be in it for Iran? Why accept new restrictions if sanctions remain, military threats continue, and Washington can once again walk away without any consequences? Peace requires both sides to cooperate. So Iran cannot be expected to surrender its leverage first and simply trust that America will keep its words. For those of us in CND, of course, we must continue to campaign against nuclear weapons, but also we must campaign against nuclear intimidation. No to war, no to regime change adventures, and no to the idea that the strongest country gets to write rules that binds everyone except itself. So we should continue to demand an immediate ceasefire, protection for civilians, an end to economic collective punishment, and for serious negotiations based on equality and enforceable guarantees. And we must remember that finally, that what finally might change the calculations in Washington, it's not moral condemnation, because that hasn't been enough. Images of destruction have not been enough. Clearly, optics don't matter to Trump, but fuel prices do, disrupted trade does, and the cost of living does. So we must amplify those messages for our ideology, our perspectives to resonate with ordinary people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Maryam, and thank you for joining us on your travels. I don't know if you're able to stay with us for a few minutes there. We have got some questions in the chat. One I asked earlier. What I think I'll do is I'll pose the questions, and then I'll just ask our speakers to come back for 2 minutes each if you want to address the questions or add to what you've heard or what you've said so far. So the first question was basically, is closing the Strait of Hormuz still a good tactic for Iran to show deterrence towards their aggressors, given that Trump can manipulate oil prices? I think there's been quite a bit on the situation with the Straits, but if anyone wants to pick that up in particularly. The second question could keep us here all night. How do we challenge the endless hypocrisy of our UK government? Again, I think we've addressed some of that in the meeting, but people might want to come back and talk about the actions that we're embarked on, which are aimed at challenging the hypocrisy of our government. And another question is for all speakers. In your view, is there any hesitation or wariness within the UK pro-Palestinian anti-war movement when it comes to backing opposition to the war on Iran? And what steps could be taken to ease any concerns or uncertainties? It may be that Sophie and Shabbir are in a position to talk a bit more about that, because our organisations have been working with partners in the Palestine movement on that, and I think we have worked together with the other organizations in the Palestine movement and to organize activities. Again, we've had a couple of demonstrations that have been backed by all 6 organizations, but Shabbir and Sophie might want to take that up in a bit more detail. It's not a question from Stephen Ladd in America. Truly grateful for this meeting and your organizing to help stop the Iran war. I hope it's okay. Since tomorrow is Hiroshima Day, I hope it's okay to mention a new short film about the global nuclear threat, An Ordinary Insanity, directed by Judith Elric, available free online. I'll pick up the link and I'll put that in the chat. So thanks for that, Sophie. And Suzanne has made a comment that we should be willing to criticize the Iranian regime as well as opposing the war in Iran. I don't think anyone here has justified the actions of the Iranian government internally, and I think they've made the point that what we are doing is exposing and opposing an internal war so that the Iranians can work out their own sovereignty and self-determination. But I don't know if any of our speakers want to pick that up. So they're the 4 issues in the chat. But what I'll do is I'll just come back along our speakers as it's just after 7:30 and give you maybe 2 to 3 minutes each just to pick up any of those or make some closing comments, and then we'll remind you of the key dates and links that are going into the chat. So have a look at the chat for the key dates. So I'll come back to you, Shabbir.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to all the speakers. I thought a really informative meeting we've had, and thanks for the questions. I'll try and just say some quick words about some of them. I think on the Strait of Hormuz, I think obviously it's correct that the US is sort of manipulating oil prices and so on, but it can only do so to an extent. And I think the impact on the global economy is still very clear. It's not just directly sort of speculation on oil markets, but it's the resultant costs of food and transport and so on. And actually, the thing that has helped bring prices down is his constant claim that there are new negotiations happening. But I think, there's only so many times he can do that and be obviously lying before that won't have the impact it does. I think in terms of holding our government to account, I think the key thing is we need to stay on the streets and we need to stay organized. I think, the fact that Andy Burnham had to apologize for the Labour Party's position on Gaza, however sort of meaningless that might be in real terms, is I think a testament to the strength of the movement and how it has shaped public opinion and has put them on the back foot. And I think we need to show Andy Burnham and his cabinet of warmongers and whatever that we're not going anywhere, that we are very much opposed to the war in Iran, that if he decides to continue allowing UK bases to be used in the way they are and so on, we will be there to challenge him. And that's why I think next Saturday's demonstration at RAFF is extremely important. And if you can get to it, please do. I think in terms of hesitation, I think, as Alex said, we did have several demonstrations specifically against the war in Iran, which did have the support of the organizations of the Palestine movement and so on. I think where it might not have matched the scale of the opposition to the genocide in Gaza would, in my opinion, primarily be down to the game that Starmer played of claiming that Britain wasn't involved in Trump's war for so long. Where there is that direct role that Britain is playing in Israel's genocide, that wasn't necessarily as obvious. But as Sophie mentioned, the public from the outset have been opposed to this war. So I don't think it's a question of that. It's more of mobilizing people, and I think we can do it. And just quickly on the question of the sort of human rights abuses of the Iranian government, I mean, I think it's right, and we shouldn't sort of gloss over what's happening domestically in Iran. But what we need to bear in mind as anti-war activists in Britain is that what we can do and what we can be effective at is challenging our government. And what our government is doing is not improving the human rights situation in Iran at all. It's costing the lives of thousands of Iranians. If anything, it's reducing their ability to hold their government to account and to challenge their government internally. And so that's what we need to be doing. And I think the sort of in the mainstream media and certain sections of the Iranian diaspora and, the Zionist movement and so on, want to try and exploit the real grievances of Iranian people and the situation domestically in Iran to cover Western imperialism. And I think we can't let that happen. So just as a final sort of summing up point, I think as everyone has demonstrated, this is a dangerous moment, but it's also one in which we have the force of public opinion behind us. We have the strength of a movement that has been building over the last 3 years behind us and longer than that. And I think we need to galvanize and we need to get more organized. If we're going to match the scale of the situation and the rush to rearmament and more war, and we need to be more organized and we need to mobilize. So please be out at the demonstration next Saturday. Please do everything you can to build the 10th of October and the other international days of action. And we'll see you on the streets.
Thank you very much, Shabbir. I'll go straight to Atefeh. Do you want to take 2 or 3 minutes? Are you there?
Sorry, it took a while to come off mute. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks, Alex. And thank you, Shabbir. I think you covered it beautifully. I'm just going to echo a few things that you said and add a few things as well. So in terms of the price of the oil, I mean, this is a bit more of, I guess, I have bit more of my expertise, I guess, the energy sector. There's only so much you can do with manipulating the price of oil by talking. I mean, oil is a physical thing. So if oil and gas is not flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, then you are going to have supply and demand issues, and that's just ultimately what's happened. So you can't make oil; it has to be extracted and it needs to be delivered to the right places. And also, 20% of energy, oil and gas, does go through the Strait of Hormuz, so it has a significant impact on the world when those ships are not basically passing through. Also, I think when it comes to oil and gas companies in general, just for a bit of context, the price of oil going up and down has a huge impact on these countries or on these companies, sorry. But then there is a threshold. So when oil starts to hit around 120, which we did see it hit 120, that's when a lot of companies will start to countries will start to struggle, and that's the breaking point for the market. So yes, as much as they try and control it with words, ultimately, if it does start to hit those higher rates, then countries will start to feel it. They have to tap into their reserves, and that's not something that they want to do. So Iran does have a lot of leverage, and it is a lifeline for Iran, and they absolutely should be using it to protect our country. In terms of pressure on the government, I mean, us being on the streets is costly for the government, right? Like, forget the fact that, we're raising awareness. That's probably the most important thing. We are working towards educating our society in general on what's going on. But people being out on the streets has a cost for the government. So the more we're coming out and the more we're actually keep our presence, whether it's protests, whether it's just demonstrations, the government is feeling it. So I think if we ease that pressure, then we will have even less impact, because a lot of people might believe that, we've been protesting for so long. Why have we not seen a change? I think had we not been protesting, we'd be seeing some more horrific stuff happen around the world. So I think we've actually had an impact, but it's just hard to measure because we don't know what we've actually managed to stop. And in terms of the question about Iran's internal politics, as we said, this is not a conversation about Iran's internal politics. I think there's a time and place to talk about everything. What we do within our country, it's our business and it's for the people to deal with. Iran has been on a political journey for a long time, and we should let the people decide what they want to do with their government. That's not a conversation for here, and it doesn't justify killing Iranians. Just because we have a problem with our government here doesn't justify another country attacking the UK because of some issues that we're facing. There are courses to go through. Political change doesn't happen overnight. We are on a journey, and please, let's not undermine and look at this in such a condescending way, because Iran has been on such a journey and we've seen so much change in our country. So let's not be blind to that. We're here to protect our country. We're not here to talk about Iran's internal politics. And I think I'm going to leave it at that because I don't know what the other question was. Sorry. Thank you.
Oh, you're fine. You don't have to answer all of them. We're picking them up as we go along. Well, it was about the other organisations in the Palestine movement, and Shabbir's answered that, and I've answered that. And just to say, say we were very pleased that at the last Palestine demo a few weeks ago, we did have a speaker from Iranians Against the War on the platform. So that did show a commitment from the Palestine Coalition to supporting you. So thank you for that. Thank you for your answers, Atefeh. Straight on to Sophie.
Thank you. Okay, I'll kind of do them in probably slightly different order. I mean, I think the whole thing around the tactics, what we're attempting to do, this is not a new thing for the anti-war movement. What we're attempting to do is to build the broadest, biggest movement possible against war. Yeah. And so that's what we were trying to do against the war in Iraq. Yeah. So therefore, we would work with everybody who wanted to stop the illegal bombing of Iraq. And the same applies in terms of the illegal bombing of Iran. That's what we're trying to do. Bring the majority of people together, unified against war. So just to sort of clarify that on that. I mean, I think in terms of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, is it still a good tactic? I mean, really, when you look at the scale of the US military might, it is the biggest, military power in the entire world. You know what I mean? Next to Russia, it has the second largest, nuclear arsenal in the world. It's absolutely massive. And so I think really Iran was in a situation where it, only had sort of certain strategic sort of, leverage. There was only certain, leverage that it had. And I think, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz was that. I mean, that's kind of why it's done it. And I think that, it had kind of limited kind of choices. And I think that that's why it's done it. It is having an absolutely, huge impact on the world. And I think more and more people are understanding, how critical that strait is in terms of sort of world oil flows, but also in terms of fertilizer and all that sort of stuff. So I think it also is sort of showing how critical that that part of the world is, and why that needs to be kind of understood. But obviously the most important thing is that this war is brought to an end, and that the strait is opened. And if the US administration implements in full the memorandum of understanding, then that's going to happen. So that's what needs to happen as far as I'm concerned. Then in terms of what more can be done to sort of expose the hypocrisy of the British government, certainly the nuclear hypocrisy. I mean, I would say people need to be sort of standing up and calling out Britain's nuclear hypocrisy, the fact that it's now, it's replacing its nuclear weapons, it's buying these US nuclear capable fighter jets, which are only going to increase the risk of nuclear war. This is what people need to be calling out. But also, I think it's really important to kind of call out the absolutely obscene costs that are associated with this massive war drive, but also with nuclear weapons. I mean, the replacement of Britain's nuclear submarines, which, for instance, they're not protecting us, are they, from these forest fires? They're not protecting us from the extreme heat wave that's resulted in over nearly 3,000 people in just 2 months in this country from dying. These are not protecting us from the fact that 15,000 people died last year. Excess deaths of 15,000 because of the terrible delays in our A&E services because of all the cuts. Yeah, this is a reality. People are dying now unnecessarily because of absolutely obscene and totally unnecessary cuts to our public services, and a complete failure to act and prepare for climate change, and to be taking action, to kind of cut our carbon emissions. We're in a situation where, in order to fund the 15 billion extra on military spending, the government is cutting capital spending for climate action. Yeah, cut totally the wrong direction. And as I say, the idea that bombers and nuclear submarines are going to protect us from climate change and from poverty, you know, and from people not getting their operations is it's complete reverse, isn't it? And so that's really critical. We need to be talking about the real security issues that we face and the real things that are going to keep people safe. You know, I think why aren't we trying to protect and stop these deaths now? It's like some abstract thing that we're going to be sort of defending people in the future from some kind of abstract threat, but we're not defending those people now. It's absolutely obscene. And then just finally, in terms of you know, the anniversary of Hiroshima tomorrow and Nagasaki over the weekend. I mean, I would say that we can never let such horrific war crime happen again. You know, absolutely obscene what happened to the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I think the critical thing is that was never done. That was never defensive action. You know, the US said, we have to do this, you know, this is the only way to stop the Second World War. Complete lies. The US knew that Japan was totally prepared to surrender under terms that were completely acceptable to it. This was all about the US making sure that it came out of the Second World War as the dominant power. Yeah, so it didn't end the Second World War and save lives. It started the nuclear arms race, and it basically allowed the US to be like the dominant power, and that set the world order that we are still suffering from today. Yeah, which is where one country can feel that it can, you know, determine the future for the rest of the world, and that has to be, you know, in its interest. So we have to end that world order that is totally dominated by the nuclear threat. Absolutely critical that we get rid of nuclear weapons. You know, they are putting us all at risk every day, you know, and they are all, you know, just look at the nuclear test veterans. They will tell you that nuclear weapons don't keep you safe. You know, they are still suffering decades on, and the government has still refused to give them compensation. So we need to be focusing on, we've got to put the pressure on the British government to be totally changing its direction. We need to be investing in saving lives, not destroying them. And we need to be working in global cooperation rather than this kind of competition, which is just dragging us towards a global war that could go nuclear. And we know the vast majority of people are on our side. More and more people understand how serious and urgent the climate crisis is now. They see the global recession coming. So we just need to be confident in our arguments and keep putting that pressure on the government.
Okay, thank you, Sophie, for that rousing finish to our meeting. I'd want to thank you all for being here. We've put a lot of information into the chat for you. I'm just going to run through some reminders, but I think meetings like this are important for us to come together. The times are very scary, but meetings like this should give us hope and help to mobilize us, bring us together to consider our thoughts, gather our thoughts, and then go out and mobilize. That's why we want to do things like this. And we want to mobilize for the protest at RAF Fairford next Saturday, the 15th of August. Details on the CND website. And then key dates in the autumn. The 10th of October will be the Palestine demonstration that will mark the 3rd anniversary of the start of the assault on Gaza. The 30th of October is the International Dock Workers' Day of Action, and then the week of the 20th to the 22nd of November, a weekend of action on militarization and conscription, including Student Day of Action. You can find details of all those on the Stop the War and CND website. If you're not already members, join Stop the War, join CND, and be part of the anti-war movement that reflects majority opinion in this country for welfare, not warfare, an end to militarization, and for peace in Palestine and against bombing in Iran. We are the majority. Let's go out and mobilize people to those aims. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for all you're doing, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks very much.